The ruler of the known world, the living God who commanded 25 legions and held the fate of millions in his hands, was on his hands and knees, crawling through a filthy sewage pipe, his silk robes catching on the grime as he sobbed in terror. This is the story of the final hours of the Emperor Nero, a man whose life was a monument to absolute power and sadistic indulgence, and whose death was the most pathetic, cowardly, and humiliating end of any tyrant in history. As dawn broke on the 9th of June, 68 AD, Nero was hiding in a squalid room in a freedman's villa just outside Rome, a shivering, paranoid wreck. The man who had murdered his own mother, kicked his pregnant wife to death, and used living Christians as human torches to illuminate his garden parties was now weeping over a piece of stale bread, unable to summon the courage to take his own life. His final hours were not a grand tragedy, but a grotesque farce, a fitting end for an emperor who saw himself as a great artist, but whose only true masterpiece was the spectacular and pathetic ruin of his own life. As the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, he could only mutter to his few remaining servants, his voice trembling with self-pity, "Qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies in me." To understand the pathetic creature whimpering in the dirt, we must first understand the toxic soil from which he sprang. On the 15th of December, 37 AD, in the coastal town of Antium, a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born. He was not just a Roman noble, he was the scion of a family so infamous for its violence and instability that it stood out even in the brutal world of the Roman aristocracy. His paternal ancestors, the Ahenobarbi, were legendary for their explosive tempers and casual cruelty. One had killed a man by gouging his eye out with his finger. Another had driven his chariot over a child in the street for sport. His father was a dull, brutish man known for his love of gladiatorial games and his utter lack of redeeming qualities. But the true architect of the boy's destiny was his mother, Agrippina the Younger. She was not just a woman. She was a force of nature, a living embodiment of ambition, ruthlessness, and dynastic survival. Agrippina was the great-granddaughter of the divine Augustus himself, but more importantly, she was the sister of the mad emperor Caligula. She had grown up in the heart of imperial power, a world where murder was politics and poison was the key to advancement. She had survived her brother's insane reign, endured exile, and had returned to Rome with a singular, all-consuming goal: to place her son on the throne. The boy, who would one day be called Nero, was born into a world where his own mother was a master of conspiracy. His great-uncle was a god, and his uncle was a monster. His destiny was not just written in the stars. It was soaked in blood from the moment he drew his first breath. To understand the full story of how this child, born of poison and intrigue, would become the most infamous tyrant in Roman history, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell, because this is a descent into madness that you will not want to miss. Nero's path to the throne was a masterpiece of maternal manipulation, a game played by Agrippina with a skill and ruthlessness that would have made Machiavelli proud. After her brother Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, Agrippina, newly returned from exile, saw her opportunity. The new emperor was her other uncle, the bumbling, scholarly, and easily influenced Claudius. Using her formidable powers of seduction and her high-born status, she maneuvered her way into his bed, and in 49 AD, into a shocking and controversial marriage. For a man to marry his own niece was deeply unsettling even to the Romans, but Agrippina pushed it through, securing her position as empress. With her foot in the door, she began her master plan. Her first move was to sideline Claudius's own son Britannicus, the legitimate heir to the throne. She persuaded the aging Claudius to officially adopt her son, Lucius, who was then given a new, more powerful name, Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. He was now Nero, a prince of the imperial house. Next, she arranged for Nero to be betrothed to Claudius's daughter, Octavia, further cementing his claim by linking him directly to the current emperor's bloodline. She systematically purged the court of anyone loyal to Britannicus's mother, replacing them with her own allies. She had Nero's tutors replaced with men she could control, most notably the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, who would become key figures in his early reign. By 54 AD, her work was almost complete. Nero was the designated heir, his position secure. All that was left was to remove the final obstacle, the Emperor Claudius himself. One evening, at a palace banquet, a special dish of mushrooms Claudius's favorite was served to the emperor. The mushrooms had been laced with a deadly poison. Claudius ate them, fell ill, and died in agony hours later. While direct proof is impossible, ancient historians like Tacitus and Suetonius are all but certain that Agrippina was the poisoner. She had played the game perfectly. Her son, a handsome, artistically inclined boy of just 17, was now the undisputed master of the Roman world. But she had made one fatal miscalculation. She believed he would remain her puppet. The first 5 years of Nero's reign, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, were a golden age for the Roman Empire. Guided by his experienced advisors, Seneca and Burrus, the young emperor ruled with a surprising degree of wisdom and moderation. He reduced taxes, reformed the legal system, and showed a deep respect for the authority of the Senate. When asked to sign his first death warrant, he reportedly hesitated, sighing, "I wish I had never learned to write." He was praised as a merciful and idealistic ruler, a breath of fresh air after the reigns of the monstrous Caligula and the bumbling Claudius. The people adored him. He was young, handsome, and charismatic, with a deep passion for the arts, particularly music, poetry, and chariot racing. It seemed as though Rome had finally found its philosopher king, a ruler who would bring peace and prosperity. But behind this public facade of benevolence, the poison of his upbringing was beginning to work. The first sign that the Golden Age was a sham came just a few months into his reign at a palace dinner party. The guest of honor was his 14-year-old stepbrother, Britannicus. The boy was still a potential threat, a rallying point for any who opposed Nero and his mother. During the feast, a cup of wine was brought to Britannicus. It was tested by a food taster and found to be too hot. Cold water was added to the cup, but the water itself had been laced with a fast-acting and untraceable poison. Britannicus took a sip, and within moments, he collapsed, choking and convulsing, his breath stolen from him. He died on the spot, in front of the horrified dinner guests. Nero, with chilling composure, calmly remarked that the boy was merely having one of his epileptic fits and ordered the feast to continue. It was his first murder as emperor, a cold, clinical, and public execution disguised as a tragic accident. The mask of the merciful ruler had slipped for the first time, revealing the face of the monster underneath. Nero was learning to balance his public image as a beloved artist prince with his private reality as a paranoid and ruthless killer. With Britannicus out of the way, a new and far more dangerous power struggle began to consume the court, the battle between Nero and his own mother. Agrippina had put her son on the throne, and she expected to rule through him. She saw herself as the co-empress, demanding to be consulted on every political decision, her face even appearing alongside his on early coinage. But Nero, now a young man tasting the intoxicating fruits of absolute power, had other ideas. He was growing tired of his mother's constant interference. He wanted to indulge his passions for art, music, and pleasure, not sit in tedious council meetings. The final wedge between them was driven by a woman, the beautiful, ambitious, and cunning Poppaea Sabina. Nero was infatuated with Poppaea, but she refused to be his mistress as long as his powerful mother was alive, and he was married to the virtuous Octavia. Poppaea whispered poison in Nero's ear, mocking him for being a mummy's boy, goading him into asserting his own authority. The power struggle escalated into a cold war, and Nero, paranoid and resentful, decided that his own mother had to die. His first attempt was a piece of ghoulishly creative theater. He commissioned a special boat, designed with a lead-lined canopy that could be remotely collapsed to crush its occupants. He invited Agrippina to a banquet at the coast, and then sent her home on this floating death trap. In the middle of the bay, the mechanism was triggered, but the plan went awry. The canopy collapsed, but it only injured Agrippina's shoulder. The boat itself failed to sink properly, and the formidable empress, a strong swimmer, managed to make it to shore. When news of her survival reached Nero, he panicked. The pretense was over. He now had to resort to simple, brutal force. He dispatched a team of assassins to her villa. When they burst into her chambers, Agrippina, with a final, defiant act of contempt, pointed to her own abdomen and told the assassins, "Strike my womb first," the very womb that had given birth to the monster who was now killing her. They stabbed her to death. Nero had committed matricide, the most heinous crime in the Roman world. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. The last moral restraint on his power was gone. With Agrippina dead, the monster was finally off its leash. The remaining years of Nero's reign descended into a horrifying spiral of unchecked indulgence, paranoia, and murder. The carefully constructed facade of the benevolent ruler was torn away, revealing the true face of a tyrant. His first order of business was to consolidate his power by eliminating anyone with a drop of imperial blood who could potentially challenge him. Noble rivals, distant cousins, anyone with a connection to the Julio-Claudian line was systematically hunted down. Accusations of treason were fabricated, and fortunes were confiscated to fund his increasingly extravagant lifestyle. His next victim was his long-suffering wife, Octavia. She was a symbol of the old regime, a virtuous and popular woman who stood in the way of his obsession with papier. He divorced her, accusing her of being barren, and then, to clear the way for his new marriage, he accused her of adultery. When no one would confess to being her lover, even under torture, he simply had her exiled to a remote island. But her continued existence made him nervous. He ordered her execution. Her veins were cut, but in her terror, her blood flowed too slowly. She was finally suffocated in a steam bath. Her severed head was then cut off, packed in a box, and sent back to Rome as a wedding gift for her triumphant rival, Poppaea. This act of cold, calculated cruelty shocked even the jaded Roman aristocracy. It was a clear signal that no one was safe, that the emperor's personal whims now outweighed all laws of God and man. The Roman state was no longer an empire. It was the personal property of a deranged artist, king, and its citizens were merely props in his bloody plays. In the summer of 64 AD, disaster struck Rome. A fire broke out in the crowded shops near the Circus Maximus, and, fanned by a strong wind, it quickly engulfed the city. For 6 days and 7 nights, the Great Fire of Rome raged, a terrifying inferno that destroyed 3/4 of the city, leaving hundreds of thousands homeless and destitute. As the city burned, a rumor spread like wildfire that the Emperor Nero himself had stood on the roof of his palace, watching the destruction, and, inspired by the spectacle, had put on his theatrical costume and sung an epic poem about the burning of Troy, accompanied by his lyre. While historians like Tacitus doubt the truth of this story, Nero was actually in his villa at Antium when the fire broke out and rushed back to Rome to lead the relief efforts. The rumor stuck. It perfectly captured the public's growing perception of their emperor as a detached, self-obsessed artist who cared more for his art than for his people. Nero's actions after the fire only fueled these suspicions. On the vast, smoldering ruins of central Rome, he began construction of his new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This was not a palace. It was a monstrous monument to his own ego, a sprawling complex of villas, gardens, and an artificial lake covering over 300 acres. The interiors were gilded, inlaid with jewels and mother-of-pearl, and featured a revolutionary rotating dining room. At the entrance, he erected a 100-foot-tall bronze statue of himself in the guise of the sun god, Sol. The people of Rome, now living in squalid refugee camps, looked upon this obscene display of luxury built upon their homes and their misery, and their resentment turned to hatred. Facing a public relations disaster, Nero needed a scapegoat, and he found one in a small, obscure, and widely distrusted religious sect, the Christians. He accused them of starting the fire and unleashed a wave of horrific public executions designed as pure spectacle. Christians were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena. They were crucified. And, in Nero's most infamous act of cruelty, they were coated in pitch, tied to stakes in his gardens, and set ablaze, their burning bodies serving as human torches to illuminate his nightly parties. The woman for whom Nero had murdered his mother and his first wife, the Empress Poppaea, did not enjoy her position for long. By 65 AD, she was pregnant with their second child, having already given birth to a daughter, Claudia Augusta, who had tragically died in infancy. Poppaea was a woman as ambitious and ruthless as Nero himself, and their relationship was a volatile cocktail of passion and violent arguments. One evening, after Nero returned late from the chariot races, a furious argument erupted between them. The exact cause is unknown. Perhaps she chided him for his obsessions. Perhaps it was a fit of jealousy. In a sudden explosive fit of rage, Nero, the master of the world, lashed out with the brute violence of a common thug. He kicked his pregnant wife hard in the stomach. Poppaea collapsed, bleeding profusely from internal injuries. She died in agony on the marble floor of the palace. The heir that Nero so desperately wanted was gone, killed by his own hand in a moment of petulant fury. The historical accounts of his reaction are chillingly detached. There was no grand display of grief, as there had been for his dead infant daughter. There was no deification. He gave her a lavish state funeral, delivering the eulogy himself, but his actions suggest he was largely unmoved. His focus remained on his own pleasure she's music, his poetry, his upcoming artistic tours. The death of his wife and unborn child was merely an inconvenient interruption, a brief, bloody interlude in the grand opera of his own life. The monster was now so consumed by his own narcissism that the lives and deaths of those closest to him had become meaningless. Nero's grief, such as it was, took a bizarre and grotesque turn. He became obsessed with finding a replacement for Poppaea, not just a new wife, but a perfect replica. He soon found a young boy, a palace freedman named Sporus, who bore an uncanny physical resemblance to the dead empress. In Sporus, Nero saw a chance to resurrect his lost love in the most perverse way imaginable. He ordered the boy to be castrated. This was not the brutal back-alley procedure of the slave markets. This was a clinical, surgical act performed by the finest physicians in the empire. Sporus was then systematically feminized. He was dressed in the fine silks and jewels of an empress, taught to walk and speak in a feminine manner, and was referred to publicly as my Poppaea, or my lady. The final act of this horrifying charade was a public wedding ceremony. Nero married Sporus in a lavish ritual in Greece, complete with a dowry and a bridal veil. Sporus was now the official empress of Rome, attending public functions at Nero's side, a silent, beautiful, and mutilated mockery of the woman she was meant to replace. This was more than just a sexual perversion. It was a profound act of psychological madness. Sporus became a living ghost, a walking, breathing emblem of Nero's inability to accept loss and his absolute power to warp reality to fit his own desires. He could not bring Poppaea back from the dead, so he created a new one, carving her likeness onto the body of a helpless boy. The Roman court was forced to play along with this grotesque fantasy, to bow to the boy empress, to pretend that this walking wound was their queen. It was perhaps the most vivid and disturbing symbol of how completely the emperor's private madness had consumed the public life of the Roman state. With all moral and political restraints gone, Nero's daily life descended into a relentless pursuit of sensation, a carnival of depravity that blurred the lines between art, sex, and murder. The Domus Aurea became the stage for his nightly orgies, elaborate death parties, where the suffering of others was the ultimate form of entertainment. He forced respected senators and noblewomen to participate in these events. Men of consular rank were compelled to strip naked and fight as gladiators in his private arena, their humiliation a source of great amusement for the emperor. Noblewomen were forced to act in pornographic plays, their degradation a performance for his pleasure. Nero himself would often roam the streets of Rome at night with a gang of thugs, his face disguised, assaulting random citizens for sport. He would beat men, accost women, and vandalize property, a childish and pathetic display of power. His parties were legendary for their cruelty. He believed that true art required true suffering. To this end, live executions were often incorporated into the entertainment. A prisoner might be dressed as a mythological character and then actually killed on stage in the manner of the mythoman dressed as Icarus might be thrown from a height, or another dressed as Hercules might be burned alive on a pyre. Rape and torture were common features of these gatherings, all set to the sound of music and poetry, a grotesque fusion of high culture and base cruelty. For Nero, there was no distinction. The scream of a man being tortured was just another note in the symphony of his senses. He was the ultimate decadent, a man so bored by conventional pleasure that he could only be aroused by the absolute degradation and destruction of others. In 66 AD, Nero embarked on the journey he had dreamed of his entire life, a grand artistic tour of Greece. He saw himself not as a Roman emperor, but as a Hellenistic artist, the heir to Apollo and Orpheus. He left the governance of the crumbling empire in the hands of a freedman and set off to prove his artistic genius to the world. For over a year, he traveled from city to city, competing in all the major Greek festivals, the Olympic, Pythian, Nemean, and Isthmian Games. This was an unprecedented act. The sacred games were for athletes and artists, not for the ruler of the world, but no one dared to refuse him. The rules were changed, schedules were altered, and new contests in music and poetry were invented specifically for him. Nero competed in every event: lyre playing, singing, acting, poetry recitation, and even chariot racing. And of course, he won every single contest he entered. The Greek judges, terrified of offending the emperor, dutifully awarded him the victor's crown every time. He returned to Rome with a staggering 1,808 first-place prizes. He celebrated his return not with a traditional military triumph, but with an artistic triumph. He entered the city in the same chariot Augustus had used, wearing a purple cloak and a crown of olive leaves. His procession not of captured enemy soldiers, but of actors, musicians, and claqueurs chanting his praises. He was, in his own mind, the greatest artist the world had ever known. But while he was living out his artistic fantasy, the empire was unraveling. The tour was ruinously expensive, bankrupting the treasury. His long absence from Rome created a power vacuum, and his neglect of military and administrative matters bred deep resentment among the generals and governors on the frontiers. The artist was composing his masterpiece, while his world prepared to burn. The beginning of the end came in March of 68 AD. A revolt broke out in Gaul, led by the governor, Julius Vindex. While Vindex's rebellion was quickly crushed, it had lit a spark. Shortly after, the governor of Hispania, Servius Sulpicius Galba, also declared his opposition to Nero. This was a far more serious threat. Galba was a respected senior statesman from an old patrician family. When he declared Nero a public enemy, the legions of Spain rallied to his side. The news sent Nero into a panic. At first, he was dismissive. Then he flew into a rage. Then he collapsed into a state of indecisive despair. He proposed bizarre and fantastical plans, such as leading an army of concubines against the rebels, or appearing before them unarmed and weeping until they submitted. While he dithered, the situation in Rome spiraled out of his control. The Praetorian prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, seeing which way the wind was blowing, betrayed Nero. He promised the Praetorian Guard a massive donative, a cash bonus, if they would abandon Nero and declare their allegiance to Galba. The Guard, the very men whose job it was to protect the emperor's life, deserted him. This was the fatal blow. Without the Praetorians, Nero was defenseless. The Senate, which had lived in terror of him for years, was suddenly emboldened. They convened, declared Nero a hostis publicusum enemy of the state, and, in a final, humiliating act of contempt, they sentenced him to the death reserved for the lowest of criminals, to be stripped naked, tied to a post, and flogged to death with rods. The master of the world was now a condemned fugitive in his own city. He fled the palace in disguise, accompanied only by Sporus and 3 loyal freedmen. His empire, his power, and his fantasies collapsing behind him. Nero's final hours were a pathetic odyssey of fear and self-pity. He and his small group of loyalists made their way to a suburban villa owned by his freedman, Phaon, just a few miles outside Rome. The journey itself was a series of humiliations. He had to travel on horseback, his face hidden by a cloak, and at one point, his horse shied at the smell of a nearby corpse, causing his disguise to slip. He was recognized by a passing retired soldier who, in a moment of lingering loyalty, saluted him as emperor. To avoid the main roads, which were now being patrolled by soldiers searching for him, Nero was forced to abandon his horse and make his way through a thicket of reeds and thorns. His companions had to lay their cloaks down on the ground so he could crawl on his hands and knees through a narrow tunnel that led into the back of the villa. He emerged into a small, squalid cellar, a damp and miserable hiding place for the man who had once lived in the gilded splendor of the Domus Aurea. There, in the dark, the final act of his psychological collapse unfolded. He wept, not for the people he had killed or the empire he had ruined, but for himself. He lamented the loss of his palace, his beautiful costumes, his artistic career. He refused the stale bread he was offered, but drank a little warm water from a flask, remarking with bitter irony, "So this is Nero's boiled water." His companions urged him to end his life quickly, to avoid the shame of being captured and publicly flogged to death. One of his servants, trying to steal his master's courage, told him,
Remember what they did to the people you tortured.
The reminder only sent Nero into a fresh wave of panic. He was the monster who had delighted in the suffering of others, and now he realized, with dawning horror, that he would not die in glory. He would die like one of his own victims. The final scene of Nero's life was not a tragedy. It was a black comedy of cowardice. He tried to stage his own death like a dramatic scene from one of his plays, but his nerve failed him at every turn. He ordered his servants to dig a grave for him, weeping as he looked at the hole and repeatedly moaning, "What an artist dies in me." He held a dagger to his own throat, but he could not bring himself to push it in. He would test the point, then pull it away. His hand trembling, he begged one of his servants to kill him first, to set an example of courage, but no one would obey. He was a man who had commanded the deaths of thousands, but he was incapable of commanding his own. Time was running out. They could hear the sound of horsemen approaching, the soldiers sent by the Senate to arrest him. The terror finally gave him a sliver of resolve. With the soldiers just moments away, he placed the point of the dagger against his neck again. But still, he hesitated. In the end, he had to be helped. His loyal secretary, Epaphroditos, placed his hand over Nero's and pushed, driving the blade into his throat. Even then, he botched it. The blade missed the vital artery, and he began to choke and gurgle on his own blood. Just as he was dying, the centurion in charge of the soldiers burst into the room. Seeing the emperor bleeding out on the floor, the soldier rushed forward, trying to staunch the wound with his cloak, pretending he had come to save him. With his last gasping breath, Nero looked up at the soldier and uttered his final delusional words. "Too late. This is fidelity." Then he died, his eyes wide and staring with a horror that terrified all who saw it. The moment Nero's death was confirmed, the city of Rome erupted in celebration. The terror was over. The people, who had lived in fear for so long, poured into the streets. They wore the pileus, the cap of a freed slave, a powerful symbol of their liberation. Festivals broke out across the empire. In the cellar, the boy Empress Sporus, still dressed in the fine robes of a queen, knelt beside Nero's body in silence, a tragic and lonely figure at the end of the bloody spectacle. Nero's few loyal servants managed to give him a private funeral, wrapping his body in white and gold robes and cremating him on a pyre, his ashes placed in his family tomb. The Senate, now free from his tyranny, acted swiftly to erase his memory. They ordered a full damnatio memoriae. His name was chiseled from public inscriptions, his statues were torn down, and his laws were rescinded. His monstrous golden house, the symbol of his narcissistic indulgence, was systematically buried. Over the next few decades, new public buildings were constructed on its site, a deliberate act of returning the land to the people of Rome. The artificial lake was drained, and upon its foundations, the Flavian emperors would build the most famous monument in Roman history, the Colosseum, an arena for the people, built on the grave of a tyrant's private pleasure palace. Nero's pathetic death marked the end of an era. With him, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family line that had begun with the divine Augustus, came to a final ignominious end. His death plunged Rome into a year of bloody chaos known as the Year of the Four Emperors, as rival generals tore the empire apart in a brutal civil war to claim the vacant throne. The historians Tacitus and Suetonius, writing in the decades that followed, would meticulously document the horror of his reign, ensuring that he would be remembered not as the great artist he believed himself to be, but as one of history's most infamous monsters. His legacy is a timeless and terrifying warning about the corrupting nature of unchecked power, the dangers of narcissism, and the fine line between genius and madness. His final words, "What an artist dies in me," have echoed through history as the ultimate expression of his profound and tragic delusion. He saw his life not as a reign, but as a performance, and his cruelty not as a crime, but as a form of art. In the end, the only masterpiece he ever truly created was the story of his own spectacular downfall, a drama whose final act was not a noble tragedy, but a pathetic, cowardly, and justly deserved death in the dirt.